I think obviously he's got a conflict in Iran that remains unresolved. He's got to focus on trying to bring that to a conclusion in a way that ends with the US rather than Iranian victory. He's also got the shadow of his tariff policy being in somewhat ruins given recent Supreme Court declarations, and he will of course be trying to put that back together without of course necessarily alienating China and getting in the way of trade deals, which probably are on the cards as well. And then, of course, there is the shadow of the Taiwan dispute, which will sort of rumble on through his visit, which will no doubt be on his mind. So I think he enters with a mind crowded with various policy options, and the outcomes will be quite interesting to see. Xi approaches this slightly differently. He's also got a number of concerns. He too is concerned about the Iran war, mainly because, of course, that is disrupting supplies to Iran. There are oil issues, although China is, of course, an oil producer itself. It's got reserves, but it does also import a lot of Iranian oil. Commodity prices have gone up. The Chinese economy is sluggish, and that is hurting domestic producers. And so he needs those markets, or rather those producers, to be enabled to sell again in a more competitive manner. He's also got to look at the trade situation with the US in general. He doesn't want to provoke a trade war, that's quite obvious. So he needs to come to some meeting of the minds with President Trump on that, noting, of course, that there is the potential for an investigation still into Chinese unfair practices in global trade, of which there are many, and he'll be aware of that as well. And lastly, of course, he's got the Taiwan issue, the same as Donald Trump, to consider, but on the other side. How does he get the US to move on an issue where the US has been fairly resolute on, and come out with some kind of sense that he has got the upper hand on regaining Taiwan? So all those things will be swirling around the Chinese leader's mind as he goes through the motions with Trump as well. Can the Chinese bring any pressure to bear on Iran? That's really the question. Now, they obviously can. There is a relationship between Iran and China, and the Chinese did veto a UN Security Council resolution recently about blame for the sort of problems in the Strait of Hormuz. So there's clearly something the Chinese can do. Of course, the question would be, what's the Chinese price in exchange for helping here? If they do, for example, deliver Iran to a more compliant position, what do the Chinese get in return? So there will always be a deal to be done on those terms, and the question, of course, is the price of that deal worth doing a deal with China on Iran, or is it better to keep going in the way that Donald Trump is going? The real question is, where does this war end up? And that obviously will not be resolved in Beijing necessarily. That'll be resolved between Washington and Tehran. China will probably want tariff reductions, a promise that the investigations into Chinese unfair trade practices will be dropped. That'll probably be the most likely focus, because it'll be a trade-based deal. It'll be, well, if we get the Strait of Hormuz opened again, I mean, yes, we benefit, obviously, because we get supplies coming through to China, but we also want some recognition that we did it. So we would like you to drop your tariffs on us in exchange for it. So I'm sure there'll be some kind of deal along those lines that is at least spoken of to try and get the Iranian peace moving forward. Taiwan is very tricky, of course, because the US position has been quite resolute in saying that although it doesn't sort of want to see Taiwanese independence per se, it also does not want to see China taking control of Taiwan by force or by coercion in any way, shape or form. I mean, Taiwan is a democratic country, it is a democratic ally, it has a good superconductor industry. Those are things that people will be bearing in mind. So it's difficult, I think, for the Chinese to come out with any kind of real victory on Taiwan, because the idea that Donald Trump's going to abandon Taiwan seems ludicrous. And frankly, even if there were to be some kind of vaguely warm pronouncement in Beijing this week from Trump on Taiwan, there's every possibility it'll get countermanded next week. And I think the Chinese know this. So it's more a question of not probably provoking Trump in any way, shape or form during this visit, so that he then emerges out the other end with a tougher Taiwan policy against China. So it's more about, can we just keep things on an even keel? Can we impress him? Can we sort of show him a good time so that he doesn't hit us with things afterwards, is probably the mood on that one. China is in a stronger position in certain respects. It's got record exports. It's obviously, its economy is much bigger than it was 10 years ago. It is benefiting, I think, somewhat from the global situation and concerns about the US internationally, which has encouraged some countries to form closer relationship with China. But the economy is also faltering. It is not growing at the pace the Chinese need. So there is a bit, and quite clearly, US tariffs would hurt the Chinese economy still, and are hurting the Chinese economy. So from that perspective, it's a bit of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And obviously, the Chinese path to a soft landing is to somehow persuade Trump that tariffs are a bad idea, which will be, I think, difficult given his love of the tariff word, and that actually, sort of freer trade is a path to prosperity. That's probably where they need to land in this. It's different. They do have some levers. They've got the rare earths issue, of course. We know full well that given their large control on the rare earths market, that has already stayed the US hand on some of the tariffs. So there's been a sense that they can use that. But there are limitations, of course. If the Americans feel that they're being bullied or attempted to be bullied, they will, of course, respond in kind. So, again, it's a tightrope, and Xi has to walk it just as, in a sense, Trump has to. I think a lot depends on where, firstly, Trump wants to reposition his tariffs movement, given the challenges from the US Supreme Court. Does he want to double down? Does he want to find ways to get round that, that sort of position, to reinstall them? Or does he think, look, I've now got an opportunity to reshape things. I've got, 2.5 years left of my presidency. I will now pivot in a certain different direction. That doesn't mean he's going to give up his ideas on tariffs. Those are long-held ideas. He clearly enjoys, the sort of principle behind them. But it might mean that on this trip he wants to come out with some kind of statesman's-like, sort of bargain deal, etc., that he can show the American people that there's progress happening in trade terms. So again, a lot will depend on just how it unfolds, I think, and frankly what's on the table from the Chinese. The idea the Chinese are going to have it all their own way, and the Americans are going to negotiate hard here. They've got obviously a big trade delegation as well. There are deals to be done, but they're not deals to be done at any price. The price will want to be, the Americans will want a good price. So much will depend on how those negotiations go, and whether the Americans feel they're coming out of this with a good deal, and the Chinese the same way. That's the principle behind, I suppose, all trade movements. Do both sides think there's a better outcome from negotiating and getting to an end point than not? This is the great unspoken, isn't it? The fact there is an AI arms race, as it were, between China and the US, and it's hotting up. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So I think the Americans are obviously cognizant of the threat China poses in this area. The Chinese are good at, so far, mimicking American technology, as it were, but they've yet to break through into their own sort of significant leadership in the area. So the US retains, of course, that kind of R&D edge, innovation, on the innovation side, certainly. The Chinese have made great strides in other areas, and of course they're investing huge amounts of money into the field. So I think obviously the point here will be not to give the Chinese any kind of competitive edge, any sort of deals that are done, but it's quite interesting that you have got this large contingent, as it were, of AI sort of companies going along as well, because clearly they're interested in the opportunities the massive Chinese market also offers. So there won't be anything that will infringe or impinge on US national security concerns, I think. But I think both sides will be quite interesting to learn where the other is, or what will be revealed. And I think there'll be a lot of sleight of hand here to try and not give away the position as to where the country might be, and where its sort of investments might be. At the same time, trying to learn as much about the other as you can in that process. So I think the insights picked up here will help shape the AI landscape for the next 5 to 10 years.